first, 3 charts. They're not my charts, so I'll whiz through quite quickly because I have a lot of bespoke hospitality charts I think you're going to find really interesting. But just to set some context, I'm going to borrow some charts from the Bank of England, who forecast major economic indicators. So I'm just going to look at unemployment, GDP, so economic growth, and there's a third one, inflation, because that's a hot topic at the moment. So this is the projection for GDP, economic growth. Unfortunately, the most interesting part of this chart is the big spiky bit that happened during the pandemic, which is what happens when you turn an economy off and then turn it back on again. It sort of falls through the floor. GDP contracts by 25% and then it grows by 25%. So the important thing to take away from this chart is that in the next sort of 3 to 4 years, growth is hovering. I mean, it's flirting with zero, essentially. So whether we are in recession or not is almost a technicality about whether it sort of goes on either side of this line. That's not great news. And, you know, one of the big barriers to growth at the moment is labour shortages, with you know, a sector like hospitality saying we could be raising so much more revenue, but we are held back by labour. So that's something to consider. The next chart looks at unemployment. Now, unemployment right now is about 3.7%. That's incredibly low. That means there are just very few people looking for and available to work. Which, you know, is why policymakers are so much more interested in looking at these inactive groups. So inactive being people like students, people who are retired, and seeing if they can squeeze any more labour out of these groups. Interestingly, during the pandemic, it only rose from sort of 4 to 5%, so a very small rise. That was due to the furlough scheme, which maintained jobs. And, you know, it is expected to rise, but only to about 5.5% in 2026. So really, in the sort of immediate term, the next 18 months, we're still looking at an incredibly low level of unemployment and, you know, a lot of difficulties getting hold of people. So now, to move on to the charts that are slightly more interesting, and I'll slow it down. I just really wanted to get those 3 out of the way. No, there's inflation. I forgot inflation. I'm so sorry. Okay, so inflation, you know, the story is it's very high. It's already peaked. We were at sort of 11, down to 10, and it's going to be on its way down. I mean, it's interesting that, you know, the Chancellor says we're going to halve inflation. That's just what inflation sort of does anyway, because the numbers fall out the back after a year, and then it sort of goes that way. But, you know, there's still implications here. You've got to remember that if inflation goes from 11 to 10, all that means is prices are still rising by 10%. So the kind of cumulative effect of all of this inflation might be a 20% increase in the price level. And this is not good, particularly for sectors like hospitality, which probably rely on a bit more discretionary spend. It's where someone might rein in some spending. Essentially, we say, as economists, the elasticity of demand is quite high. People are quite responsive to elasticity of income, their income. So the next slide, this is not the prettiest slide. But the point is that it's vacancies, but it's been split out by industry. So accommodation and food services is our sort of hospitality industry, and that's the red line here. There's only one industry that's higher, which is not very good with the human health and social work activities. So that's probably obvious, but we can see the level pre-pandemic here. Actually, Kate alluded to this in her opening speech, but it's now up here. So we're almost kind of twice the level almost, which is, you know, you can see it starting to soften a little bit, but the point being that vacancies are at a record high. Whilst unemployment's low, so the supply of available staff is relatively low, the demand for staff, I would still describe that, despite the softening, as red hot. There's red hot demand for staff. The next chart, this is some data I made for an article in the Financial Times a couple of weeks ago, and we wanted to contextualize the vacancies. So we sort of said, what are the vacancies as a proportion of the size of the workforce? And again, accommodation and food services, I mean, the bar just blows everyone else out of the water. It's 8.6%. What this means is that hospitality is trying to replace or expand its workforce at a greater extent than pretty much any other sector. It's kind of interesting that the next biggest sector is almost kind of half as much. So again, this is trying to capture both the supply and the demand. It's sort of saying that there's an incredibly high demand, and as a proportion of how many people work in that sector, that's what the gap we've got to sort of fill. Challenges. So I've gone through a few things: immigration, demography, and ways of working. I think you'll find these charts really interesting. What I really like about hospitality is I don't have to work too hard to find a story. When hospitality is sort of blowing everyone else out the water, you can sort of see the trend, and I don't have to sort of say too much. So this is actually quite an ugly chart, and I do apologise, but there's various sectors, and this one here is accommodation and food services. This is the proportion of foreign nationals in January, March 2020 and October to December 2022, which was the latest data I had available. What is fascinating is the European Union, excluding UK, has gone from 15 to 9.4. So we have a sort of 5.6 percentage point drop in the proportion of people who are EU nationals in the sector. That is just huge. That's massive. I mean, you can see that just such a large proportion of the sector who were previously foreign nationals are now not. And that's happened in a very short space of time there. That's sort of 2.5 years. These are some other sectors who have also been sort of affected by this, but you can see that the drop in the bars is very marginal compared to the steep fall in accommodation and food services. Our next chart, we were really surprised when we looked at this. So this is the hours that people work, which we've split by EU and UK means, the UK average. And it's a density plot. And essentially, this is the EU workers here, this is the UK. So UK workers are working about, and this is just for hospitality, by the way. UK workers are working sort of 25 hours, EU sort of 31. There's about a 6-hour difference. If you lose EU staff, pound for pound, you're losing more labour supply. So in terms of sort of full-time equivalents, as a recent paper suggested that there's a shortfall of 330,000 EU workers in the UK economy that would have been here if we hadn't ended free movement. But you've got to imagine, because they work more hours, that's maybe more like 400,000 people in terms of equivalent. I don't think anyone's made that point yet, but this is a chart from an upcoming report we're doing on immigration. But it's particularly stark with hospitality, so that's why I've included that. Finally, so I've looked at age breakdowns, penultimate age breakdowns, and again, accommodation food services, it just comes at the top in terms of the lowest number of sort of 50 to 64-year-olds. So we've got about 20% over the age of 50, and I've ordered it by that bar, and right down to agriculture and forestry and fishing, which is over 50%. An alternative and perhaps easier way of looking at this is to just do the average age by industry. And again, so accommodation and food services comes at the bottom with an average age of 35, which is relatively young. I say relatively young because 35 doesn't feel super young, but compared to every other sector here, right up to agriculture, forestry and fishing, which is at 48. You can see there's a step change. There's like a very smooth transition and then a bump from 40 to 35. No other industries close, really. So that's problematic. So this comes from a report that I did about understanding older workers, and we sort of looked at the various ways in which they work. And the standout point from this report was that they really have much higher levels of flexible working, much higher levels of homework, self-employment, part-time working. And the CIPD's got plenty of guides on inclusive recruitment and how to sort of target these people. And obviously there's UK hospitality guides as well, specific. One point I wanted to make about the age profile is that if we compare 30 years ago, these are individual ages, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 24. So 30 years ago up here to today, there are just such smaller levels of work amongst young people. They really do not work very much now. In fact, if we had, they don't. I mean, education and work, they just don't mix. They used to. They used to have Saturday jobs. You used to transition into work a bit sooner. But if we compare 16-year-olds, there are, let's see, what have we got here? Inactive student is sort of 70%, and it was closer to 50. But employee, 35% in 92, now 13%. It's about a third, and that carries on all the way up the age distribution. And what that means is if we had the same employment rate of young people today as we had 30 years ago, there would be an extra million people in work. So this trend of kind of increasing adolescence and more study and transitioning into the labour market later is taking millions of people out of the labour market. And that's something that I suppose organically hospitality will have been dealing with over the last 30 years. But it's just an interesting trend that it's probably going to get even more difficult to rely on younger people. Final chart, again, a difficult one to sort of make sense of, but it's working from home by industry time series since 2010. And I've sort of put a red box around hospitality. The thing to note is that it's flatlined, where other industries have really kicked off. So final chart, I've put all those lines on one chart, and I've sort of put a yellow bit around hospitality. It's not gone anywhere. So I think this is a bit of a challenge, and maybe one that you've talked about before, which is that jobs that can't offer home working may be less attractive vis-a-vis jobs that can. And there's very little, I think, that you can do. Some people say, well, John, what could you do? I think, well, unless you've got something specific you can offer that other people can't offer, I don't think that's necessarily obvious. So you might have to look at other forms of flexibility. But certainly some of these numbers are quite extraordinary. We've got, sorry, the axis is a bit small. That's 50%. So IT's way up here. And, you know, it's professional service, it's office jobs. But that's just not something that could be offered. That's pretty much it. So not necessarily solutions heavy, but hopefully I've given you, some insight that's probably things you already know, but it might give you a bit of ammo to sort of know and understand your workforce a bit better. These are all done using the Labour Force Survey or the Annual Population Survey. It's an absolutely huge sample. So this is fairly reliable data. It means that we can make charts like this, which would be pretty difficult if you didn't have such big numbers. So I have to dash, but I've put my contact details. I'm always happy to, we usually cut these data quite quickly by other ways if anyone wants any further things. But that's me done. Cheers.